Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining me for this third video on cognitive load theory. I've been delighted by the response so far, so thanks to all those people who've sent through excited messages about the things that they've taken away from the first two videos, and I hope that this third one can really build on those first two. The goal of these three videos is really to start you on a journey, or perhaps continue you along on your journey with cognitive load theory, in the hope that a greater and deeper understanding will help you to improve as a learner, but more importantly as a teacher. In the first video, I started with talking about how I got started on my own journey with cognitive load theory, how it was Dylan Williams' tweet which prompted me down the rabbit hole, and from there I explored a whole host of research on cognitive load theory, eventually went and met John Sweller, and have since had some fantastic conversations with him about the ideas. What I've shared so far and what I'll be sharing today was some of the key takeaways from those conversations and correspondences that I've had with John. And I'll also be answering a few questions that I've received since the first video. So just a quick recap, what have we covered so far? Well, in the first video, we started off with the human memory system. The key thing that we learned there was that working memory has a finite capacity and therefore is the bottleneck of our thinking. We then were introduced to the idea of element interactivity, and learn about the idea that it's really valuable for us as teachers to cultivate a sense of how many elements we're asking our students to deal with at any one time to ensure that we're not overloading them. The third idea was a strategy, and that was about simplifying conditions, and we talked about a few ways to cut out elements to make learning easier for students. And then we added to that the strategy of pre-teaching with scaffolds. In video 2, I started by answering a question about the difference primarily between intrinsic and extraneous load. We learned that intrinsic load is the stuff that we really want our students to learn, and extraneous is anything else besides, and that the majority of the research on cognitive load theory has been focused on reducing extraneous load. We also learned that the fundamental recommendation of cognitive load theory is to reduce extraneous load and optimize intrinsic load. We then talked about how information moves from short-term to long-term memory, and we finished with an exploration of the split attention effect. And the key idea there was that information that must be combined should be placed together in space and time. Today we're going to have a similar format, and I'll start by answering two questions. The first question from Sophie is stress related to cognitive load, and is stress in fact a form of cognitive load? And the second question was from George, and George's question was about the relationship between cognitive load theory and inquiry or problem-based learning. Now, this is a fantastic question. I haven't actually seen this addressed in the cognitive load theory literature specifically, but I have seen it addressed in a paper that I read a few years ago by Sendhil Mulay-Nathan. And in that paper, they talked about a few studies in which they induced stress on the participants and then measured the impacts of that stress on their cognitive abilities. So probably my favorite study in that paper took place in a New Jersey shopping mall. And what the experimenters did was they went to people and they said, imagine the following scenario. This is the first condition. Your car is just broken down and it's going to cost $300 to fix. What we're going to get you to do now is a cognitive aptitude test. And they got them to then do that cognitive aptitude test. So that was the first condition. In the second condition, it was very similar. They got people in and they said, all right, imagine your car's just broken down, but this time instead of it costing $300 to fix, what they told participants was, and it's going to cost $3,000 to fix this car. And then they did the same thing. They said, okay, you don't worry about that too much right now. What we want you to do right now is to do this cognitive aptitude test. The results of this study were really interesting. What they found was that it made no difference to affluent people whether they were told that their imaginary car would cost $300 or $3,000 to get fixed. However, for the less affluent people, it made a significant difference. And they found that those who were less affluent and told that their car was going to cost $3,000 to get fixed did significantly worse on the cognitive aptitude test. The term that these researchers used to describe this phenomenon was cognitive bandwidth, and they said that part of the participants' cognitive bandwidth was spent thinking about this potentially stressful situation. And for those for whom it would have been a big challenge to come up with $3,000, it was using more of their cognitive bandwidth because they were more stressed. So in answer to your question, Sophie, yes, stress can be a source of cognitive load, and it's actually a source of cognitive load that can operate in the background and subconsciously, and that our students have to deal with. Stress can impose cognitive load. The next question was from George and is as follows. My first response to this question would be, about the idea of teasing out some of the differences between inquiry, problem-based, project-based learning and things like that. Something I've discovered through my own explorations that even two ideas that share the same acronym, PBL, for project-based learning and problem-based learning, can mean very, very different things. So in terms of problem/inquiry-based techniques, I don't feel like I can respond to both of those in one neat, concise answer. And in addition to that, what James and Kate are proponents of, and they're two of my favorite people in education because I think they're doing such inspiring and exciting and promising work. They were implementing what they called a learning skills curriculum. So it wasn't actually so much inquiry, though some of it was problem-based. A lot of it was actually explicit instruction and explicitly teaching and helping students to learn how to better manage themselves. And this is something that actually meshes really well with some recent research into cognitive load theory. So some of the research that's right at the forefront of CLT research at the moment is about self-management of cognitive load effects. So for example, a lot of this research has occurred around self-management of the split attention effect. So last time we learned about the split attention effect and how splitting students' attention can induce extraneous cognitive load. What can actually happen though is once a learner learns about the split attention effect, they can actually start to integrate instructional materials for themselves. So for example, now that I know about the split attention effect, I will do things like use the split function on a PDF. So if I'm reading an academic study and there's a diagram here and the words about the diagram on the following page, I'll use a function in my PDF reader that says split page so I can independently scroll the top and the bottom and make sure that I keep the image in view whilst I read the description about it. That reduces split attention for me and helps me to understand that content better. So to me, this is the most exciting forefront of cognitive load theory research, the way that we can actually help students to learn how to manage their own cognitive load. And if you'd like to explore that a little further, there's a couple of references there. Another area in which self-regulation of cognitive load effects is gaining a bit of ground is in the idea of redundancy. So redundancy is basically just helping students to understand, or the self-management thereof, is basically helping students to understand the impact that redundant information, whether it be redundant pictures, redundant text and things like that, has on their learning and how it impedes their learning, and then teaching them that they can actually ignore that redundant information if they want to learn more. And here's two studies if you'd like to explore that more. Okay, so this is what we've covered so far. That question from Sophie about stress and cognitive load, and then from George just now about cognitive load theory versus inquiry. Let's jump on to the transient information effect. Okay, so this is how I summarize the transient information effect, and I'll put it just here for you to see. Let me show you what this means. Imagine you're teaching some students about punctuation. You could have a set of slides that go as follows. Here's the first one. So we're learning about punctuation. Here's our first idea, the full stop. There's a rule and an example. Here's the second idea, the comma. Here's a couple of rules and a couple of examples. All right, so now students, you all understand the idea of the rule for the full stop and the rule for the comma and the examples of each. All right, let's now do this task. Your task now is to take this text and add full stops and commas into it in the appropriate places. Ready, set, go. Okay, so you can see there that what I've done is I've modeled transient information. So the ideas, the concepts that students need to understand to do this task are actually on prior slides. They've disappeared when the time comes for the students to actually do this task. And what we're doing there is we're asking students to hold those definitions and those examples for the full stop and comma in working memory whilst they try to do this task. That is inducing unnecessary working memory strain for those students. So let's look at So this is a non-example. Let's look at an example of how this activity could be slightly altered to make it much easier for students. Firstly, for the initial slides, what we can actually do is present the information in a way that it's all on one slide. This means that students can choose whether or not they move on. Maybe they're reading at their own pace. Maybe you've presented a later idea, but they just want to remind themselves about the full stop rule whilst you're talking about the comma rule or something like that. Setting it out like this enables them to do that. And then when we move on to the actual task slide or the worksheet or whatever it may be, we can just include there a little remember section or a little summary section that students can then refer to ensure that they're not suffering from that transient information. And there's the task. So it's a very, very basic idea, this idea of transient information, but it's a really valuable one and one that we should keep in in mind at all times. It's particularly important because of the fact that slideshows are such a popular form of presentation in the classroom, and yet they're so subject to transient information. So this is a really valuable thing for us to keep in mind. Another way we can get around transient information is to continue to repeat the key ideas like this and have multiple touch points to similar concepts within a presentation. So this is what we've covered today: stress and cognitive load theory versus inquiry. And there I introduced the idea of the self-management of cognitive load effects and how beneficial that can be if we actually teach our students about cognitive load. And then the final idea there, transient information effect. When we ask students to hold information in working memory, that can be a source of extraneous cognitive load. Now, that doesn't actually mean that every time that we ask students to hold something in working memory, it's extraneous, because actually remembering key information can be a really valuable generative learning activity. But in the early stages of learning, when a high level of scaffolding is valuable, then we need to really be conscious of that transient information effect. This was the final short video for you subscribers on cognitive load theory, but really it's just a start, and I've only had a chance to touch on a few of the key ideas in cognitive load theory, but there's so much more to learn. As mentioned, I've been in correspondence with John Sweller for the last year or so about key ideas within cognitive load theory, and I've been working with John to summarize those ideas in clear and concise terms, hopefully in a similar way to as they've been presented in these 3 videos, and then to make them accessible for teachers to use and to really improve their practice. I'm not going to tell you that much more about that today, but tomorrow I will send you one final email that includes an opportunity for you to continue your journey with cognitive load theory. That email will include an offer that's only for a limited time. It'll only be for 24 hours. So make sure you check that email quickly in order to get the best access to that resource. I hope you've got some value out of these 3 videos. And thanks so much to all those people who've commented about what they've got out of them and sent me questions along the way. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions, but I hope the ones that I did answer were valuable for you. I really appreciate you giving up some time out of your busy day today, and I'll see you tomorrow for one very short video and what I hope will be for you a very exciting offer. Thanks for your time today, and I'll see you tomorrow.